We've been talking about it. We're going to continue to talk about it because I think it's the most important issue going into the 2022 election, the 2024 election, and that is election reform. And I've spoken about this on the program before. I go back to my experience in 1996 as a campaign manager for a U.S. Senate race, the year after I was elected to office, in which we experienced voter irregularities and fraud. And the laws did not allow us to challenge it within, we had to like 3 days, maybe 5 at the most. We couldn't get all the information together. We took it to the U.S. Senate, who was the final arbiter, and they didn't have the backbone for the fight. But we came back, and a number of us in the next 2 years reformed our election laws in my state of Louisiana. And guess what happened? Not only have we not had any major voter fraud, I mean, there's been some in pockets, but not statewide. And we went from a state that was blue with one statewide elected Republican to a state now where we only have one statewide Democrat. The state continues to trend red. Because why? Because elections are free and fair. Well, this is something states need to be involved in, and you have a role to play in it. Joining me now to talk about this, Hans von Spakovsky. He is a senior legal fellow at Heritage Foundation and basically has put together a to-do list on how we reform the elections at the systems at the state level. Hans, welcome back to the program.
Tony, thanks for having me back.
Okay, let's talk about this. You've put together basically a checklist of ways that states can ensure that their elections are free and fair and people can have confidence in the results.
Yeah, it's a list of best practices recommendations. And look, I came up with this list based on a lot of years of experience in this area, and not just looking at election fraud and problems, but having been a county election administrator in 2 different states. But I also consulted with a lot of election experts on this. And so we came up with this list that we think would fix many of the problems and many of the vulnerabilities that we particularly saw in the last election.
All right, let's start with the list. Let's start at the top. Verify the accuracy of voter registration list. People would say, well, I mean, that's not being done?
No, it's not. I mean, there's so many basic things that states and counties could be doing and aren't doing. And I'll just give you one quick example of it. It's just such an easy fix, and yet it's not being done. Look, we actually have a problem with people not registering where they live. In every state, you have to register at your residential address. But a study that I saw caught people registering at commercial addresses, pawn shops, casinos in Nevada, et cetera. That's an indication of fraud going on. Well, look, this is an easy thing to solve. What is the one big priority of county governments in every state in the country? It's collecting property taxes, right? That's how they fund everything. Their county tax department have detailed information on every single property in the county for tax reasons. Yet election officials, when somebody registers to vote, when somebody sends them a form saying, "Hi, I'm Joe Smith and I live at this address," they're not running that address over to the county tax department and saying, "Well, is this really a residential address? Is it a single family home? Is it an apartment complex? Or is it a UPS store or a county park?" They're not doing something just as basic as that to prevent
That's
people
an easy
from registering
fix.
someplace.
That's an easy fix.
It's an easy fix.
Because before you go on to that, but I want people to understand the significance of the problem is that you have voter rolls that people have registered and they've never been cleaned up. One of the issues we had back in '96, and I know this is one that you hear often, dead people voting. But I mean, when somebody's been dead for 20 years and they're still on the voter rolls, you got a problem.
Yes, and in fact, one of our recommendations is states ought to be on a very constant, regular basis doing data comparisons with the Social Security Administration's Master Death Index. They keep a database of deaths across the U.S. They have to do it for Social Security purposes, and states ought to be checking that, not just relying on the vital records departments in their own state to try to find people who have died. Otherwise, for example, they can't find people who maybe used to live in your state but died somewhere else.
But now they won't have any problem finding you if you owe taxes.
Right.
They'll track you down. But when it comes to voting, they just can't seem to get it right in terms of cleaning up the voter rolls.
Right.
I want to go to the second one, which seems, again, these are so simple, but people need to realize they're not being done. Verify citizenship of voters.
Yeah, and that's a real problem. I mean, we've got verified reports. We have cases from all over the country of people who are not U.S. citizens who are registering and voting. And the reason, of course, right now is that it's so easy for them to do it and not get caught. Folks who have filled out a voter registration form know that they actually ask you that on the form. Are you a U.S. citizen? You're supposed to check a box, yes or no. But if you are an alien and you check, yes, I'm a citizen, election officials don't do anything to actually check that information and verify that information. Contrast that with the fact that under federal law, as you know, Tony, every employer in the country has to verify when they hire a new employee whether that person is a U.S. citizen or whether they are an alien who's here legally and has a work permit. And yet somehow people think, oh, we shouldn't be doing that with voting?
It's astounding, I guess the only way I can say it. Now, here's one that we actually used in Louisiana, which I think is one of the most significant steps, is requiring voter ID.
Yes. Yeah, that is extremely important. It's not, some people think that's the be-all, end-all. It's not, but it's one of the most important steps. And what's most important is to extend it not just to in-person voting, but these days it needs to also apply to absentee balloting. Right. And that is very important, particularly think of the difference that might have made in the last election.
Right. Well, and that's your next item, limit absentee ballots.
Yes. Look, nobody disputes that we need absentee ballots for people who are too sick, physically disabled, can't make it to the polls on Election Day. But it should be limited to folks who have a valid excuse like that. The reason being that they're the only kind of ballots that are voted outside the supervision of election officials and outside the observation of poll watchers. And that makes them vulnerable to being stolen, altered, and to voters being pressured in their homes to vote a particular way. And we've seen that happening in cases all over the place, including places like Texas and Mississippi and elsewhere.
The next item is preventing vote trafficking. Explain that one. Well, in
every state, when you vote by absentee ballot, you can mail your ballot back. You can deliver it yourself in person. A member of your family can deliver it. And in most places, a designated caregiver. Unfortunately, in about half of the states, they've authorized anybody to come to your door to offer to deliver your ballot. And what does that mean? It means that you're putting something valuable, a ballot, into the hands of third-party strangers who could be campaign staffers, candidates, party activists, political consultants. All of them have a stake in the outcome of the election. And that gives them the opportunity to alter or change, or maybe not deliver your ballot at all if they know that you regularly vote for folks of the opposition party. And so it's just not a good idea for any state to allow third-party strangers to pick up and deliver your ballot.
Now, that's completely legal in the state of California. They legalized that once the Democrats had a supermajority. Are there other states that allow that?
Yes. There's about 24 states that allow it. And as Tony, you probably know, right now there's a bill being pushed through Congress by the Democrats, H.R. 1, that would mandate that states allow vote trafficking, and it would override bans on it that certain states have.
Yeah, what the Democrats in Washington are doing is just what they did in California when they seized control out there and got a supermajority. They moved to secure that majority forever by changing the election laws. All right, I don't want to run out of time here. Allow election observers complete access to the election process. Again, seems like that's pretty common sense.
It is, but as you know, in the last election, we saw observers being shut out, being put so far away they couldn't see what was happening. And states need law punishing election officials who engage in that kind of behavior. You know, if they know they're subject to discipline, termination, possible civil fines, if they don't allow observers in, well, then perhaps we won't see the kind of behavior again that we saw last fall.
Yeah, and that was a big issue. Providing voting assistance.
Yeah, look, there's no question some people need help when they go to vote. They may not speak English well. They may be illiterate. They may be physically disabled. But to avoid, once again, people being coerced and pressured and otherwise told how to vote, anyone who assists a voter should have to fill out a form, produce an ID, so that we know who they are, their identity, the reason they're getting the assistance, so that if there's a problem later on, we know who did it.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say something. I was biting my tongue. People do need help voting. There's quite a few people out there that need help voting after this last election, it looks like. But that's another story. The prohibiting of early vote counting. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, what's dangerous about that is there are moves afoot, including, again, in that bill being pushed through Congress, for states to start processing and counting votes before Election Day. And, of course, the problem with that is that the federal bill would require 2 weeks before Election Day to start, is that, look, if that information on early returns is then leaked out,
which it will be.
It could, for example, folks who work in election office could leak it to the losing candidate, who might be of their political party, and that gives them tactical and strategic information. Say, we're behind, and it's in these particular neighborhoods where the votes have been counted. We need to go out there and to find people to vote or collect their absentee ballots.
Right.
To make sure we can change the results of the election.
Or it will send a message that, this guy's so far ahead, there's no sense, I don't need to go vote for him. So it discourages voter participation. Number 9 is provide state legislatures with legal standing. Explain that.
Well, one of the problems we had in the last election was state officials, this happened in Pennsylvania, for example, basically, the Secretary of State and the governor there saying, well, we're just not going to apply state law. And there, they changed the deadline for the receipt of absentee ballots and just ignored state law. And many legislative officials and others who tried to do something about this had their cases dismissed for lack of standing. And what I'm recommending is that legislatures and, frankly, citizens ought to, by law, be given the ability to sue state officials who are not complying with state election laws.
That, I think, is quite significant, because that has been at the basis of a lot of the issues surrounding this election, where you had state officials who did not have the constitutional authority unilaterally making these decisions. This clearly puts it back in the hands of the legislature. All right, Hans, we're almost out of time, but one you didn't have on the list, but I think one that deserves discussing, is allowing third parties to put money into the hands of election officials to aid them. For instance, we saw that Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook fame, gave $400 million, 350 to this one nonprofit that gave grants to local election commissions, and it was targeted to turnout vote in particular precincts.
Well, Tom, I'm glad you mentioned that. The article that I published about this at the Daily Signal was just a short summary of a much larger publication that we put out on Monday at the Heritage Foundation that contains a huge, long list of recommendations. And one of the recommendations on there is that state legislatures ban county, local, state election officials from receiving any private funding, because that inevitably brings up not only conflicts of interest, but the possibility that people in some jurisdictions will be given a greater opportunity to vote than others.
Yeah. Hans, that music tells us we're out of time. I want to thank you for joining us. Great work, and we're going to encourage people to take your advice to heart and get busy.